I think my talk is going to be different from what you might expect from a talk on international cooperation. It will be much more personal. It's an expansion of a TEDx talk I did in Princeton, New Jersey, titled Purpose, Poverty, Pitfalls, and Redemption, in which I'm going to talk about how committing my life to ending global poverty has given purpose and meaning to my life, the pitfalls that I'm facing along the way, especially in microfinance, and how seeing redemption in the work that I support has helped return me to my original commitment and vision. Before I begin with my story, I'd like to begin with a reading and two quotes. This reading comes from the New York Times. It was on the front page of the New York Times, and it's on child labor in Africa. And the title of the article, and I'm just going to read the first few paragraphs, is Africa's World of Forced Labor in a 6-year-old's Eyes. And when I first read it, my daughter was 5 at the time. And I really urge you to think of a 6-year-old you might know, your child, your niece or nephew, your grandchild, a neighbor. Just think of a 6-year-old you might know as I read these first paragraphs. Just before 5 a.m., with the sky still dark over Lake Volta in Ghana, Mark Quadro was rousted from his spot on the damp dirt floor. It was time for work. Shivering in the pre-dawn chill, he helped paddle a canoe a mile out from shore. For 5 more hours, as his co-workers yanked up a fishing net inch by inch, Mark bailed water to help keep the canoe from swamping. He last ate the day before. His broken wooden paddle was so heavy he could barely lift it. But he rapidly followed each command from Quadro Taki, the powerfully built 31-year-old in the back of the canoe, who freely deals out beatings. "I don't like it here," Mark whispered out of Mr. Taki's earshot. Mark Quadro is 6 years old, about 30 pounds, dressed in a pair of blue and red underpants and a Little Mermaid t-shirt. He looks more like an oversized toddler than a boat hand. He's too little to understand how he is wound up in this fishing village, a 2-day trek from his home. But the 3 older boys who work with him know why. Like Mark, they are indentured servants, leased by their parents to Mr. Taki for as little as $20 a year. And I'm going to read that last little section. He's too little to understand why he is wound up in this fishing village, a 2-day trek from his home. But the 3 older boys who work with him know why. Like Mark, they are indentured servants leased by their parents to Mr. Taki for as little as $20 a year. End of quote. That's as much as I'm going to read. I've read this little excerpt to thousands and thousands of people, and when I finish, I always say the same thing. I am crystal clear. I am crystal clear that well-targeted and well-run microfinance, well-targeted to the very poor and well-run, can empower families to take care of their children so they don't have to resort to selling them. One reason I say this is because 20 years ago, I was with Muhammad Yunus, the founder of the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, and I asked him, what's the first thing a woman does with the proceeds from her micro business? Expecting him to say, well, the first thing she does is she puts her children in school, or she feeds the family better. No, that's not what he said. He said usually the first thing she does with the proceeds from her micro business is she brings her children home. She couldn't afford to feed them, so as young as 5 or 6 years old, she puts them out with other families to work or sweep, barely in exchange for a handful of rice, and the first thing she does with the profits from her micro business is to bring her children home. So my talk this evening is not about someone else's life or a trendy development in microfinance. It's not about the 20,000 children around the world who die every day from mostly preventable malnutrition and disease, or about the 61 million children of primary school age who are not in school. It's really about what we can do about it and how we can change that. Finally, let me share these two last quotes before I tell my story that point again to the purpose and the poverty section of my talk. This quote now is from a Republican senator who passed away last year, a U.S. Senator, Mark Hatfield, who said, "We stand by as children starve by the millions." I'm going to repeat that. He said, "We stand by as children starve by the millions because we lack the will to eliminate hunger. Yet we have found the will to develop missiles capable of flying over the polar cap and landing within a few hundred feet of their target. This is not innovation. It is a profound distortion of humanity's purpose on Earth." Let that sink in. I'm going to repeat it. Hatfield said, "We stand by as children starve by the millions because we lack the will to eliminate hunger. Yet we have found the will to develop missiles capable of flying over the polar cap and landing within a few hundred feet of their target. This is not innovation. It is a profound distortion of humanity's purpose on Earth." And isn't it time that we begin to consider that question more? What is humanity's purpose on Earth? I'm going to give this one second quote, this last quote. It's from the inventor and futurist Buckminster Fuller. And it really guided me when my life took a turn from, as you'll hear in a moment, from music to ending global poverty. Buckminster Fuller said, "The things to do are the things that need doing, that you see need to be done, and that no one else seems to see needs to be done." I'm going to repeat it. He said, "The things to do are the things that need doing, that you see need to be done, and that no one else seems to see needs to be done." That's that permission to take action that maybe no one else sees is needed. Here's my story. It's a rather odd path. I started with degrees in music at the university. I played percussion instruments in the Miami Philharmonic Orchestra in Florida for 12 years. And then I started a citizen lobby on ending global poverty, and then started the Microcredit Summit Campaign, and more recently started the Center for Citizen Empowerment and Transformation. A lot of times people, what was that about? How did that happen? What was your motivation? And when I look back through my life, there are two events early on that come particularly to mind. In 1964, I graduated from high school, and I played timpani in the orchestra at graduation. And just before the graduation ceremony began, a flute player came back to the percussion section and told me that a high school fraternity brother of mine, a year younger, had died the day before in a tractor-trailer accident in Georgia. It was her next-door neighbor, so she knew before I knew. And you know, I was 17 when I graduated from high school, and I thought I had forever. You know, you're 17 and your life will never end. And during that period, the mourning period, the funeral, after the funeral, I went with his brother to collect my friend's report card from the homeroom teacher. I remember thinking, maybe I have 17 more minutes, or 17 more months, or 17 more years. And I began to ask, why am I here? What am I here to do? What is my purpose in life? And 4 years later, on college graduation day, 1968, U.S. Senator Robert Kennedy, President Kennedy's brother, was assassinated. On graduation day, he died. And it was another one of those, what is this life? What is this death? Why am I here? What am I here to do? What's my purpose? No answers. But the question is getting very clear now. And 9 years later, I am invited to a presentation on the Hunger Project, on ending world hunger. Now, I never thought about ending world hunger much. In fact, I was oblivious. I never thought about it. But if you looked right underneath oblivious, I was hopeless. I mean, I would say world hunger is, well, it's inevitable because there are no solutions. Well, because if there were solutions, somebody would have done something by now. So I went to the presentation and I realized the obvious. There was no mystery to growing food. There was no mystery to accessing clean water, basic health, basic literacy. None of that stuff was mysterious. I wasn't hopeless about the lack of solutions. Oh no, I was hopeless now about human nature. That people would just never get around to doing the things that could be done. But there was one human nature I had some control over, my own, and my question, why am I here? What am I here to do? So I started to get involved. In 1978 and 1979, I spoke to 7,000 high school students in Miami, Florida, where I lived, and Los Angeles, California, where I moved. And before I went into the first classroom, I read some statements from the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, Food and Nutrition Study, and others that called for the political will to end poverty. And so I asked 7,000 high school students, what's the name of your member of Congress? What's the name of your member of Parliament? I don't want to know if you met them. I don't want to know if you wrote them a letter, just the name. Does anyone want to guess the number out of 7,000 that knew the name? Out of 7,000, 200 knew, fewer than 3%, and 6,800 did not know the name of their member of Congress. And so this group results was started out of this gap between the calls for the political will to end hunger on the one hand and the lack of basic information on who represented us in Washington on the other. We started in 1980. I finally moved to Washington, D.C. as the first staff member in 1985. We lobbied for a small UN agency in Rome called the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD. And IFAD sent us 3 videos of programs they'd invested in. And one of the videos was a Dutch documentary about a little bank in Bangladesh. This is 1985. About a little bank in Bangladesh with 42,000 borrowers called the Grameen Bank. And over a 1-year period in 1987, we had legislation introduced on microcredit, and the volunteers generated 100 editorials. You were talking about the CNN effect. Well, where the newspapers, not letters, there were those, but where the newspaper wrote editorials saying we should support these microloans for the poor in 1985. In 1987, Muhammad Yunus came to our office and he spoke by conference phone to editorial writers in 28 U.S. cities. And this was 19 years before he won the Nobel Peace Prize. So no one had really ever heard of him before that happened. And meeting Muhammad Yunus was a very critical moment in my life and really has inspired much of my action over the last 25 years. What I'd like to do is tell you the brief story of how Grameen Bank started, but tell it in a way that's different from before, with more of the spiritual transformation at the center. After getting a PhD in economics at Vanderbilt University in the United States, Professor Yunus returned to Bangladesh to teach at a university. There was a famine in his country, and he said, the economic theories in my textbook are very elegant, but they're not working in the village next to my campus. I'm going to go in the village and learn economics from the villagers. Now that's the way I used to tell the story. What I used to leave out and I'm putting in now is that this young economics professor was having a spiritual crisis. People were dying of starvation basically on the doorstep of his campus. And he said, I used to dread going to my own lectures with their elegant theories. And he said, I'm going to go into the village next to the campus to see if I can be of use to one person for one day. Not the 40 million that his bank later would touch, but to see if I could be of use to one person for one day. It was 1976, and he went into the village and he met a woman, Sophia Khartoum. And she made bamboo stools for sitting on. And he asked her, how much money profit do you make from making these stools? And do you know what she said? She said, I make 2 pennies a day profit. 2 pennies. He said, how is that possible? It's a beautiful stool. Why do you only make 2 pennies a day profit? She said, well, I don't have the money to buy the bamboo, so I borrow the money from a trader, a moneylender, on the condition that I sell the finished product back to him at a price he sets. And the price he sets barely covers the cost of the bamboo. I make 2 pennies a day profit. He said, well, if you could sell it to anyone, could you make more than that? And she said, I could, but I don't have the money to buy the bamboo. I have to keep borrowing the money from the trader, from the moneylender. So he had a student go around the village to find out who else borrowed from the moneylender. And the student found 42 people who needed a grand total of $27, less than $1 per person. And he lent 42 people a grand total of $27 from his pocket so that they could pay off the moneylender, buy their raw materials, make whatever their product was, and sell it to the highest bidder. And he did this, and this woman, Sophia Khartoum, went from 2 cents a day profit to $1.25 a day, immediately, because now she could sell her stools to the highest bidder. And these 42 people became the first borrowers of what eventually became Grameen Bank, or Village Bank, or Rural Bank. Today it has over 8 million borrowers, affecting some 40 million family members. And one other glimpse of this revolution came many years ago when I was listening to him do a question and answer period. And one of the questions was, what was your strategy in forming Grameen Bank? And his answer was, I didn't have a strategy. I kept just doing what was next. But when I look back, my strategy was, whatever banks did, I did the opposite. If banks lent to the rich, I lent to the poor. If banks lent to men, I lent to women. If banks made large loans, I made small loans. If banks required collateral, my loans were collateral free. If banks required a lot of paperwork, my loans were illiterate friendly. If you had to go to the bank, my bank went to the village. Yes, that was my strategy. Whatever banks did, I did the opposite. Do you see the revolution there? The breaking of rules? This leads me to the pitfalls section of this talk. One question that comes out of Professor Yunus's statement, whatever banks did, I did the opposite. Well, the question is, what happens when some microfinance groups start acting more like banks? What happens to that portion of microfinance? What happens to the soul of microfinance? I'm fortunate to have been one of the leading advocates for microfinance over the last 25 years, and we've been so successful that everyone is coming in to the field, including some who want to use commercial funds to get microfinance to more and more people, and others who want to make money off the poor. So in this section, I'm going to focus briefly on an initial stock offering, an IPO, the first IPO in microfinance. It's like there's a fork in the road, and this fork says, how are the investors doing? The commercial investors. This fork says, how are the clients doing? What can we do for the clients? This fork says, what can we do for the investors? Well, this is about the investor fork, not the way it should go. The Compartamos IPO in Mexico was called a breakthrough by many, but it also was a great controversy and spurred at least 2 initiatives geared to guarding against the problems that became very public during the IPO. One was the SMART campaign on client protection, and the other was microfinance transparency to make interest rates transparent. At the time of the Compartamos IPO, the Compartamos was charging 85% interest on the loans, and the government charged 15% tax. So between the interest and the tax, the clients were paying 100% interest and tax. As Professor Yunus said, we started microcredit to free people from the money lenders, not to become the new money lenders. And so that's a very, very big concern. So I want to reiterate that Compartamos' very high interest rates led to very high profits, which led to the great success of the IPO. The IPO generated tens of millions of dollars in profit to the senior managers. There were 6 institutions that invested $1 million each and walked away with $100 million each on this IPO. What did the women in Compartamos get? Nothing. Nada. 0 from this. So I had an epiphany at the Africa Middle East Region Microcredit Summit 2.5 years ago in Nairobi, Kenya. And this leads to my last section, the section on redemption. I now see that the spiritual dimension of microfinance, the redemptive dimension of microfinance, is central to my vision for the field. The technical issues are important, but only if they serve the transformational dimension. Here's an example of what I mean by redemption in microfinance, told to me by another of my heroes, Ingrid Munro of Jamii Bora in Kenya. And I must add that this is another partially sad story in that Jamii Bora did a reverse takeover bank to get a banking license, but then the new board of Jamii Bora focused more on profitability and started closing branches that were in the slums and in the poorest areas. So now Ingrid has gone off and formed Jamii Bora SACCO, Savings and Credit Cooperative. And she told me that the SACCO will be owned by the savers and the borrowers, so there won't be any chance this time for the investors to subvert the institution or its mission. Anyway, here's the story. After the post-election violence in Kenya several years ago, 6 years ago, Jamii Bora was given money to rebuild a marketplace that had been destroyed in the post-election violence. And Jamii Bora said, we have to find the rioters who destroyed the market and engage them in rebuilding the market that they destroyed. Now, I don't know any microfinance group in the world given money to rebuild a market destroyed in rioting that would say we have to find the rioters and engage them in rebuilding the market. And if they said it, I don't think they could find them. And if they found them, I don't think they could convince them to rebuild what they had destroyed. But Jamie Bora's staff are all former members, most of them slum dwellers, many of them former beggars and prostitutes and the like. So they're very close to the ground. And they found the leader of the gang that destroyed the market. He's known as the General. And they began to talk to the General about having his gang rebuild the market. When the General first met Ingrid Munro, he said, "When your staff first came to me, I was very upset because they didn't realize how dangerous I was. But anyway, they convinced the General and the gang to rebuild the market. They paid them to guard the materials at night, and they paid them to rebuild with others during the day. After the market was rebuilt, the General and some of the gang got involved in microfinance. The General uses sheet metal to build simple cases that children use when they go to boarding schools to put their belongings in. The General came to Ingrid several years ago and he said, "I haven't been to my home village for 13 years because my mother was so ashamed of me. But I just went home and she cried for 3 days because she was so happy how I turned my life around." There are lots of visions for microfinance, including this one, microfinance for redemption. The dictionary defines redemption as restoring people's honor and worth, setting them free. The world's poor need this kind of redemption. Redemption that restores their honor and worth and sets them free. Redemption that Muhammad Yunus saw when he lent $27 grand total to 47 destitute people in Bangladesh. Redemption that others in the field have seen over the years. And here's another kind of transformation the world needs, that we look at people who we see previously as the problem, instead as the solution. The world needs us to change our own thinking, rather than writing people off as hopeless and incapable of transforming their own lives. Let me close with this quote from George Bernard Shaw's Man and Superman. Quote, "This is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose, recognized by yourself as a mighty one, the being a force of nature instead of a clod of selfish grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. I am of the opinion that my life belongs to the whole community, and it is my privilege to do for it whatever I can. I want to be thoroughly used up when I die, for the harder I work, the more I live. I rejoice in life for its own sake. Life is no brief candle to me. It is a sort of splendid torch, which I got hold of for the moment, and I want to make it burn as brightly as possible before handing it on to future generations." And I'm going to repeat that. This is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose, recognized by yourself as a mighty one, the being a force of nature, instead of a selfish, feverish little clod of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. I am of the opinion that my life belongs to the whole community, and it is my privilege to do for it whatever I can. I want to be thoroughly used up when I die, for the harder I work, the more I live. I rejoice in life for its own sake. Life is no brief candle to me. It is a sort of splendid torch, which I've got hold of for the moment, and I want to make it burn as brightly as possible before handing it on to future generations." End of quote. So let us work together to ensure that we use our lives for a purpose recognized by ourselves as a mighty one, that we use our lives to bring us closer to the end of poverty or to the resolution of any of the problems that confront us and that move us. Thank you very much.